Richard Nixon had spent the better part of his lengthy political career scheming and campaigning for the presidency. In 1968, he ran on a platform that included what he called a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. In truth, Nixon wanted to keep the war going.
The last thing he wanted was for the Democrats to gain a signal diplomatic victory, an October surprise. And so he led on to the South Vietnamese that if they could hold on, that they could hope for something better from Richard Nixon.
It was the first of many illicit acts that would ultimately lead to the most shameful presidential downfall in history. Number 37, Richard M. Nixon, Republican, 1969 to 1974, 56 years old, from California. Nixon was one of the most experienced politicians of the 20th century. He'd been a congressman, U.S. senator, and vice president. But by the time he finally became president, he had also accumulated many enemies.
Nixon always kept lists of enemies, and he really saw the presidency in large part as a vehicle for punishing his enemies and rewarding his friends, and for promoting his own image.
He had within him demons, personal demons, that he really could not control. He's a man who bore deep resentments against his enemies and thought his enemies were everywhere.
What's the matter with these clowns?
Nixon's paranoia was rooted in deep insecurity. Ambitious to a fault, he harbored a desperate need to prove himself and rise above his middle-class origins. Nixon's personality reflected his management style. He was obsessed with power and had to be in control at all times. Nixon bypassed the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense so that he and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, could control foreign policy.
Nixon wanted to run foreign policy out of the White House, and partly he wanted to do so because he was smarter about foreign policy, but partly because he wanted to do it in a secretive fashion.
Publicly, Nixon endorsed a plan to end America's involvement in Vietnam. Privately, Nixon escalated the war effort by bombing Cambodia and sending the Marines to invade Laos. In May 1969, when the New York Times revealed the secret bombings, Nixon went ballistic. He ordered wide-scale wiretapping of government officials and journalists to try and trace the leak.
This was really the beginning of the in-house wiretapping in the Nixon administration, arguably the beginning of Watergate as we understand that term, sort of all of the secret illegal doings that Nixon and Kissinger and others participated in.
While Nixon and Kissinger had surreptitiously intensified the conflict in Vietnam, they also pursued a radical new plan to end it.
And the architecture that Nixon and Kissinger come up with is what's called a triangular diplomacy, in which we disengage from Vietnam while playing Russia and China off against each other.
Nixon understood that the key to peace in Vietnam was a good relationship with China, Vietnam's ally. Toward this, he forged a diplomatic relationship with the Chinese, then brokered an agreement with Hanoi in January 1973.
That we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam.
He saw that was really the only way he could ultimately pull out of Vietnam. He also saw this as an opportunity to exert leverage on the Soviet Union. And he very effectively sort of played both sides of the fence. Even as he was making the overtures to China, he was also talking with Brezhnev about starting to improve relations.
Nixon's visit to China in February 1972, followed by the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty with the Soviets in May, were the crowning achievements of his presidency. These diplomatic breakthroughs with the communist world secured Nixon's landslide re-election later that year. It also led to an official ceasefire in Vietnam. In January 1973, North Vietnam and South Vietnam agreed to stop fighting. But secretly, and without the consent of Congress, Nixon promised the president of South Vietnam that the U.S. would restart bombing North Vietnam if Hanoi violated the accord. Simultaneously, in 1973, a political scandal was heating up: Watergate.
Nixon's wiretapping of reporters, the infiltration of the student movement, the infiltration of the Black Panther movement, the possible overthrow of the Chilean government. All these things were hanging around like fireflies on a summer night when the Watergate story hit.
Nixon fought the inevitable for 2 torturous years, believing that he, as president, was somehow above the law.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
In July 1974, after 14 months of congressional hearings on Watergate, the House Judiciary Committee passed an article of impeachment charging Nixon with obstruction of justice. But before the House could vote to impeach, Nixon resigned on August 9th.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president.
He was angry. He was very angry at his enemies, but he was also angry at himself. As he looked back, he said, "I gave my enemies a sword, and they ran me through."
Nixon's legacy is divided, much like the man himself. On the one hand, he was a brilliant strategist. On the other, he will always be tarnished by Watergate. And he is the only president to resign.